Imagine this. You're an entrepreneur in the 1940s. World War II is coming to an end and the materials are finally being freed up for use by the public. You see a large gap in the safety features available in cars being made today, so you decide that you're going to create the safest car you can. You create safety features that become standard on cars even today. But here's the thing. You have gotten the attention of the big three, and they do not like to share. Welcome to Crispy Driver Presents Deep Drives, Preston Tucker, and the Tucker 48. Preston Tucker was born in September of 1903. His father was a railroad engineer, but unfortunately passed of appendicitis when Preston was only 3 years old. This didn't slow Preston down. Growing up in a suburb of Detroit called Lincoln Park, Michigan, Preston grew a love of automobiles. He even learned to drive one at 11 years old. I know a few people that learned to drive at 11 years old. At the age of 16, Preston was already making moves like Bernie Mac. He started by buying late model cars and fixing them up to sell them. He joined the Cass Technical High School, but quit to work at Cadillac Motor Company. Then, in 1922, he joined the Lincoln Park Police Department. Apparently, he joined so he could test all the high-speed cars and motorcycles that he had, only to have his mom rat him out that he was only 19 and therefore under the minimum age requirement. After that, he married his wife, Vera, who he would be with for the rest of his life. They took over a gas station for a short period. Vera actually ran the gas station while Preston worked the assembly line at Ford Motor Company. When the lease ran out on the gas station, though, Tucker returned to the LPPD, where he ended up being banned from driving into the cars for blowtorching a hole in the dash of his police cruiser just so he would have heat in the winter. Definitely a baller-ass move. Right before the lease ran out on the gas stations, Tucker had been selling a few Studebaker cars. Doing so, he met a salesman by the name of Michael Julian, who would end up working for him later on. But after meeting him then, Julian hired Tucker as a car salesman. However, because Tucker didn't like the drive to the dealership in Detroit, he ended up going back to the LPPD one more time. A few months later, though, Michael would call him up to invite him to work as a sales manager in Memphis, Tennessee. Tucker took him up on the offer only for Michael to get transferred a few years later. Tucker stayed on in Memphis and ended up working for Ivor Schmidt Agency selling Stutes, and then later the John T. Fisher Motor Company selling Chryslers, where he became the general sales manager. While selling Chryslers, Tucker would make connections with Pierce Arrow, the same Pierce Arrow who would unveil what might be the biggest flop in automotive history, the Pierce Silver Arrow. Tucker would make the move to Buffalo, New York to begin working as the regional sales manager for Pierce Arrow Automobiles. He would only stay here for 2 years, though, opting to return to Detroit where he worked as the Dodge salesman for the Cass Motor Sales. Okay, so side note here, but I think it's important. Right around the time that Tucker joined Pierce Arrow, they had just released what is possibly the biggest flop in automotive history that's ever been actually produced. They closed doors in 1938 and declared insolvency, so basically they just became not a company only a few years after Tucker left. So definitely think that may not have been Tucker's fault that he didn't end up staying there for a couple years. But maybe we'll talk about it more in another Deep Drives video. Back to Preston, though. One thing I haven't mentioned yet was Preston's love of racing. Around the early 1930s, while still in Memphis, Tennessee, Tucker had begun an annual 1-month-long vacation to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Here, he would team up with the legendary engineer Harry Miller, creator of more Indy 500 winning engines than anyone else at the time. It was through Miller that Preston would meet his future engine designer, Edward Eddie Offutt. Preston and Harry Miller would become close friends, and through their friendship, they would end up creating a company named Miller & Tucker Incorporated. Yeah, real creative, I know. But they created this company with the intention of creating race cars and marine engines. The first job they landed was building 10 race cars for Henry Ford. Yeah, that Henry Ford. After they completed the contract, Tucker would end up moving to Indianapolis, working at the new Packard Indianapolis agency on Meridian Street, owned by Dick Cott, the same owner that owned the Dodge dealership in Detroit that Preston worked at. Preston would eventually become partner in this dealership. He would, however, keep the relationship with Harry Miller until Harry's passing in 1943 due to cancer. All of these people that Preston came into contact with in these early years, and all of these jobs, all seem to be different pieces of the puzzle that Preston was dreaming of. But it would be a few more years before he could put those pieces together and make this dream come true. Recovering from an appendectomy in an Indianapolis hospital, a surgery that would have saved his father's life if it had existed in his time, Tucker was reading the news. It was when he learned about the coming war in Europe that he decided to come up with an idea for a high-speed armored combat car. So in 1939, Tucker moved himself and his family back to Michigan so he could remodel an old barn on the property to create his machine shop called the Ypsilanti Machine and Tool Company. Here he would create the combat vehicle known as the Tucker Combat Car, nicknamed the Tucker Tiger. This was an armored car capable of going over 100 miles per hour. It was so fast, in fact, that no one actually wanted it. The turret he had created, creatively named the Tucker Turret, did create some interest from the Navy. He would end up producing some, however, they never made their way to any American vehicles. Then the U.S. government confiscated his patent and royalty rights, leaving Tucker to spend years in court trying to recoup his losses. In 1940, Tucker decided to try his hand on manufacturing aircraft and marine engines. He formed the Tucker Aviation Corporation with this in mind. Still building in his shop behind his home in Michigan, he sold enough stocks of the company to develop the Tucker XP-57, a lightweight tubular frame aircraft nicknamed the Pea Shooter. Tucker even secured a contract with the United States Army Air Corps. However, due to a lack of funds, they allowed the contract to lapse and moved on to larger fighters. During his meetings with the Army in Washington, however, Tucker would get a little luck. He would meet a man by the name of Andrew Jackson Higgins of Higgins Industry. They were the builders of the Liberty ships, PT boats, and landing crafts for the war effort. Higgins would acquire Tucker Aviation Corporation in March of 1942. Tucker would then end up moving his family again to New Orleans so that he could serve as the vice president under Andrew. More specifically, he was in charge of the Higgins-Tucker Aviation Division, where they produced gun turrets, armament, and engines for torpedo boats. Things soured, though. Higgins and Tucker were too alike. They were both impatient and detail-oriented, and they were both a bit too crazy with their money. This, combined with Higgins' ongoing battle with the American government over canceled contracts, led to Tucker leaving Louisiana and returning to Michigan. Higgins actually sued him for $118,000, but the suit was later dropped. As the war came to a close, Tucker saw that the big three automakers had not come up with any new post-war models. And this was the window he was looking for. He had dreamed of developing the car of tomorrow, one that was safety-oriented with innovative features and modern styling, and this was the time. The public would get their first taste of the car in December of 1946 when Tucker's first design would appear in Science Illustrated, along with a blown-up picture of a scale model. It would be dubbed the torpedo on wheels in this article, and that would start generating the public's attention. Enough attention, in fact, that Tucker commissioned famed stylist Alex Tremulous, who had previously designed cars for Auburn, Cord, and Duesenberg. Tucker only gave him 6 days to finalize the design, and in a week, he finally had his design. Originally named the Tucker Torpedo, Tucker would change the name to Tucker 48 as to avoid bringing up the horrors of World War II. I really appreciate it because the Tucker Torpedo reminds me of a silver bullet, and if you know, you know. In March of 1947, Tucker would release a full-page ad in many of the national newspapers using the Tremulous design sketch. He also talked about the many features he planned for the car of the future, many of which would never make it to the produced cars. But this got the public in a frenzy, and they were ready to buy. So Tucker assembled a team of automotive industry leaders to create a new company called the Tucker Corporation. They would be in charge of handling and managing the sales of Tucker's cars worldwide, including places like South America and South Africa. And then he began looking for a building. I cannot stress enough while reading this, I just couldn't help but get the feeling that Preston Tucker is a man who lives by putting the cart in front of the horse. But before I go on a rant, let's move on. Preston had big aspirations, and he wanted a building that was even bigger. The Chicago plant at the time was the largest building in the world. It had previously been used to build the Wright R3350 Cyclone engine for the B-29 Superfortress. Luckily, the building had been secured by the War Assets Administration, a government agency created to dispose of surplus material and property from World War II. Tucker secured the lease from the WAA in July of 1946, contingent on him raising $15 million by March of 1947. So Tucker sold a bunch of dealership rights, and by floating a $20 million stock issue, he ended up with $17 million in the bank with just enough time. And so the Tucker Corporation was born. It was a rough start, however. Due to the counterclaims, Tucker wasn't actually able to move into the building until September, setting him back almost an entire year. Then he was unable to win the bids on 2 steel mills to provide the materials he needed for the cars. It was rejected by the WAA under some really questionable politics.
Is this foreshadowing?
Well, not if you say that. On top of all that, Tucker's intensely detail-oriented management style, combined with the revolutionary features, meant a lot of engineering. His design called for a rear-mounted low RPM engine equipped with hydraulic valves, fuel injection, and combined with the safety features that included disc brakes, placing all the instruments within reach of a driver, a padded dashboard since no airbags, self-sealing tubeless tires, a springless independent front suspension, a roll bar hidden in the roof for rollover incidents, a pop-out style windshield made from laminated glass meant to keep you from slamming into the windshield, and a headlight in the front of the vehicle that was capable of moving with the steering tires to light up corners as you drove at night. All of that really slowed down production. Many of the innovations would make it to the final prototype, but the engine, including the hydraulic valves and fuel injection, were dropped. He ended up sourcing another engine from Air-Cooled Motors, an engine that he liked so much that he purchased the manufacturer in 1947 to make sure he had a steady supply. He also had to drop the individual torque converters for a traditional transmission, and the disc brakes did not make it either. He probably would have liked to have had something like disc brakes to stop what was going to happen next. Thank you for waiting this time.
No problem.
By now, our man Tucker is no stranger to the Securities and Exchange Commission. We will call them the SEC from now on because it comes up a bit. Now, the SEC were already pissed off that Kaiser Fraser was given millions of dollars in grant money to create a car and basically did nothing with it. If you watched my last Deep Drives video where we talked about the Graham brothers, their company, Graham Page, was ultimately taken over and then purchased by the Kaiser Fraser company. I mentioned in that video that there were talks in 1947 of bringing back the Graham Page namesake, but that they ultimately never came to fruition. I would wager to bet that this is related. But back to the story at hand. The SEC are big mad at any small-time automaker company, and although Tucker had never taken any federal money, small automakers at the time were under extreme scrutiny by the SEC. Unfortunately for Tucker, that meant one of his best sales tactics would end up causing the eye of the SEC to rest solely upon him. His tactic was to sell accessories for his cars before they had been produced through a program called the Accessories Program. Doesn't that sound smart, right? However, buying one of these accessories would guarantee you a spot on a dealer waiting list. So it was basically like pre-ordering a vehicle and having to store the accessories until it showed up. But I swear it worked. It worked. He also started selling dealerships before having the factory ready to create the actual vehicles. Somewhere around 2,000 dealerships were sold beforehand. Then around September of 1947, the chairman of the Tucker Board of Directors, Harry Tolman Jr., resigned. When he left, he wrote a letter to the SEC more or less claiming that Preston Tucker had misused the funds that he had gained through selling the stock of his company. He even went as far as claiming that the Tucker 48 didn't actually run or back up, which in fairness at the time, it probably couldn't as he was still trying to make the torque converters work. In late 1947, Tucker's public opinion would truly drop. A popular journalist, Drew Pearson, did a radio segment where he described the Tucker 48 as a tin goose. He also brought up the idea that the car would be incapable of backing up, and although the final production model was very capable of backing it up, the damage was already done, and the dealerships began to file lawsuits, and the stock plummeted. Tucker did respond with an open letter to the automobile industry where he subtly hinted that bigger things were at work. Politics and the SEC seem to be singling out Tucker, and having read everything that I have, I am inclined to believe our boy. The way that the SEC handled Tucker's case makes me feel like they had to make an example of someone, and who better than a small-time automaker like Tucker. In 1949, the SEC finally made their move. In February, Tucker surrendered his records to the SEC. Led by the U.S. Attorney Otto Kerner Jr., they began a grand jury investigation. On March 3rd, the Tucker Corporation was handed over to Aaron Cullen and John Scatz by court order. By June, they filed a formal indictment on Tucker and 6 other executives on 25 counts of mail fraud, 5 counts of SEC violation, and 1 count of conspiracy to defraud. At first, Tucker seemed to be in good spirits, saying that he would use this as an opportunity to explain his side of the story. Unfortunately, the odds were very stacked against him. In June of 1949, an article would be published in Collier that leaked details of the SEC report, which weren't publicly released. In fact, during the trial, the report was labeled as secret, and even Tucker's attorneys were not allowed to read it. This article really painted a bad picture of Tucker and the 48, and the press just continued to run with it, even reprinting the article in Reader's Digest. At the time the trial finally began in October, 37 of the Tucker 48s had been built. In secret, though, a team of 300 loyal employees came and finished the last 13 cars. This gave Tucker 50 cars, not including the prototype. As you can assume, the prosecution tried to prove that Tucker never attempted to create the Tucker 48. They brought forth witnesses that had worked for Tucker in the early years, who had basically stated that Tucker's cars were made up of pieces of other cars. However, Tucker's designer, Alex Tremulous, testified that this was common practice, citing his time working on the 1942 Oldsmobile for General Motors. On this, Tucker's lawyer, William Kirby, would cite the recent issues with the government funds that went to the Kaiser Fraser Company, probably opening a very unhealed wound for the SEC. Kaiser Fraser didn't get indicted, and they got $44 million in loans from the government, didn't they? Kirby stated. It was actually closer to $200 million, but I doubt the SEC prosecutors would correct him on this. After a short break for Christmas, the trial got back to full steam, with the prosecution bringing in their star witness, Daniel Ellens, a former Tucker dealership owner who claimed to have lost $28,000 of his investment. Except that when cross-examined, he also testified that he still owned the Tucker 48 that was given to him by Preston, and that it had 35,000 miles on it. Then the SEC brought in their accountant, Joseph Turnbull, in hopes that his claims that Tucker took $28 million and spent less than a seventh on it on any research would be enough proof to prove his guilt. However, they were unable to produce any proof of financial mismanagement, even though they had Tucker's seized records. The prosecution had done so poorly that when it came time for the defense to call their witnesses, the defense refused and said it is impossible to present a defense when there has been no offense. They even invited members of the jury to ride in one of the 8 Tucker 48s that Tucker had brought to the courthouse. Then, on January 22nd of 1950, the jury came back with a verdict of not guilty on all charges. But it wasn't all celebrations. Having dealt with all these court issues, the Tucker Corporation had lost the factory building. This, combined with a mountain of debt and lawsuits, the Tucker Corporation was no more. Tucker did try his hand in the automotive industry again in the early 1950s, after teaming up with auto designer Alexis de Sakadowski. They, along with some Brazilian investors, were working on building a sports car called the Carioca. Unfortunately, though, it would never be developed. During his trips in Brazil, Tucker would begin to become fatigued. He traveled back to America, where he was unfortunately diagnosed with lung cancer. He died December 26, 1956, and is buried in Michigan Memorial Park. Although we're not driving around in Tucker cars today, he did leave a legacy that lives on in today's vehicles. Standard safety features like seat belts, disc brakes were standard in vehicles that he created, and it would take many years for the Big Three to catch up. And I think it's Tucker's legacy that ultimately secured his fate. I would wager to bet that the Big Three and the SEC conspired to take down this small auto manufacturer in the name of avarice and ego. But that seems to be the way of many small businesses. If they can't be stomped out by the nature of the large competition, then they will be stuffed out through government lobbying. This isn't to say that Tucker had no fault in this. he was definitely the poster child of putting the cart in front of the horse. It seemed like every move that he made was 2 steps in the wrong direction and 3 steps back to get back his bearings. But I do believe that he had every intention to create the Tucker 48, the car of tomorrow. And in another time and world, maybe he would have done it. Then, instead of the big 3, we would have had the big 4. Chrysler, GM, Ford, and Tucker. Well, that's it for my video on Preston Tucker and the Tucker 48. In preparation for writing this script, I watched the movie Tucker, the Man and His Dream. This movie was honestly extremely good. It does a great job of explaining a lot of what I talked about, but in a lot more condensed way to make it a lot more entertaining. Not that the events didn't occur, just that many are conflated in the movie. One scene in particular, in the end, they make a big parade out of bringing 50 of the Tucker 48 cars to the courthouse, when in reality it was probably only 8. Historical accuracy aside, though, it was an amazing film that stars Jeff Bridges and Martin Landau. I also read a majority of a book called The Indomitable Tin Goose, which is an account of events surrounding Tucker and his Tucker 48, written by Charles T. Pearson, and was published in 1960. If you're interested in any of the stuff I talked about, I highly suggest checking them out. Also, comment down below what you think. Did Tucker really set out to defraud everybody? Or did the government and other entities really have it out for Tucker? Was he guilty of being a dreamer or a schemer? Let me know down in the comments below. But if you like this video, please leave me a like. I know I say it every time, but it really means the world to me and it really helps my channel. It also really motivates me to do more long-form videos like this where I spend hours on research and making scripts. And if you subscribe, just know that I truly, truly appreciate it. But until next time, this has been Crispy Driver, and have yourself a wonderful day.